The room fell silent the moment I stepped inside. My heels echoed softly against the polished oak floor, the muted hum of distant conversation fading into a kind of watchful stillness. Sunlight filtered through the tall curtains, brushing over expensive furniture and faces that wouldn't meet my eyes. I had imagined this moment countless times, but nothing prepared me for the sight of my children, Trevor and Hannah, standing before me side by side, blocking my seat as if I were an uninvited guest in a life I'd built for them. It's for immediate family only. Trevor said, his voice clipped, his arms crossed tightly over his suit. "You're not mentioned." Hannah's tone followed, cold and precise. "Don't make a scene, Mom." I stood motionless, a calm exterior concealing the storm within. The navy blue folder in my hand felt heavy, cool, steady. I had carried it like a talisman through years of thankless responsibility, through grief and quiet perseverance. I could see the faint crease in Trevor's brow, the flicker of unease in Hannah's eyes when they noticed it. They didn't know what I held or how long I had been waiting to use it. For 61 years, I had mastered the art of composure. I'd kept promises when others broke them. I'd stayed calm when chaos swallowed everything around me. I was the backbone no one thanked, the silent order, holding my family's world together. But as I stood in Marlene's estate, the grand house that once smelled of lavender and laughter, I felt a new steadiness take root. The air was thick with tension, but beneath it was something sharper, resolve. I approached the chair they'd tried to guard my steps, unhurried, deliberate. The weight of decades pressed against me late nights with fevers and homework, the whispered prayers I'd said for their futures, the sacrifices buried beneath their ambitions. None of that seemed to matter now. To them, I was an afterthought, a name too easily dismissed, but I had not come unprepared. Inside the folder were documents Marlene and I had notarized 15 years ago. My sister, my closest friend, the one I had cared for as her memory faded. I remembered her laughter echoing through our Portland home when we were girls, and later her confusion when time began slipping through her grasp. I had been there through it all, doctor visits, late-night phone calls, forgotten birthdays. When she asked to update her will, she'd insisted I be included, knowing I had been more than a caretaker. I was her anchor. When Derek, my husband, died suddenly, I thought I had already survived my share of loss. But Marlene's illness demanded a different kind of strength, the kind that left no space for grief, only endurance. Trevor and Hannah rarely visited her. "She's not our responsibility," Trevor once said. Hannah had shrugged, distracted by her own life. So I stayed quietly managing everything while they moved on, oblivious. Now in the muted sunlight of Marlene's estate, all those years had led me here. The polished air of civility couldn't mask the condescension in my children's voices, or the whispers of relatives waiting to see what spectacle would unfold. The attorney, Mr. Harold, sat near the mahogany desk, flipping through papers with detached precision. His young assistant, Mendez, hovered nearby, her polite indifference mirroring the room's quiet disdain. I didn't speak right away. Words weren't necessary. I set the navy blue folder down on the table, its weight landing like a verdict. The faint imprint of the embossed seal caught the light. I saw Trevor's jaw tighten. Hannah's eyes flicked toward the attorney, then back at me. No one said a word. The tension was thick enough to touch. I let the silence stretch until it became its own kind of declaration. For years, I had been the calm in their storms, the invisible hand steadying their paths. Now, for the first time, I let them see what that calm had been protecting all along. Authority, proof, truth. I met Mr. Harold's gaze and spoke clearly. "Please include these documents in today's reading," I said. My voice didn't tremble. "They supersede any later amendments." Hannah blinked, confused. Trevor's composure wavered. The attorney adjusted his glasses, a flicker of surprise breaking his mask of professionalism as he opened the folder. The embossed seal shimmered under the light, and the soft rustle of paper filled the heavy silence. I watched their certainty unravel inch by inch. For the first time in a long while, I felt no need to explain myself. The truth was finally speaking for me, line by notarized line. Mr. Harold's voice filled the room steady and measured as he examined the documents. The soft rustle of pages carried over the heavy silence, broken only by the distant creak of the old estate's walls. "These are valid," he said at last, his tone quiet but absolute. "This version predates the recent amendment. It holds full legal authority." A low murmur rippled through the relatives gathered in the back rows, their curiosity sparking like small fires. I watched Trevor's face harden, his confidence slipping into disbelief. Hannah's hand rose to her mouth, a silent protest forming before she could find the words. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The truth had its own power. Trevor finally spoke, his voice sharp. "You went behind our backs," he demanded. I turned to him, my calm unbroken. "I fulfilled my sister's wishes," I said. "Nothing more." My words landed like stones on still water, small, precise, but leaving rings that widened quickly. For a moment, no one moved. The folder sat open on the table, every page a quiet testament to years of care and diligence that no one had seen. My thoughts drifted to the past as Harold continued reading. I remembered mornings by the Willamette River, the gray Portland lights seeping into our kitchen as I prepared breakfast for Trevor and Hannah. They were small then, curious, demanding full of the innocent selfishness children carry without meaning harm. I did everything for them: lunches, packed clothes, washed bills, managed love given freely. Derek would come downstairs with his slow smile, kiss me on the cheek and say, "You make it all look easy, Lenora." But it was never easy. After his heart failed, it was me against the world keeping our home standing when grief wanted to pull it apart. I took care of everything because that's what I had been taught. A mother doesn't crumble. She holds, she endures, even when her children grow and forget how much she carried for them, even when gratitude becomes silence. When Marlene fell ill, I did the same for her. I became her memory when hers began to falter. I paid her bills, cooked her meals, sat with her through endless nights at the hospital, when the machines hummed louder than sleep. I did it quietly, never expecting acknowledgement. When she began forgetting faces, she never forgot mine. "You always come back," she told me once, her voice faint but certain. "If anything happens to me, make sure they don't rewrite what's true." And I had. I'd safeguarded her wishes, filed every document, kept every copy, confirmed every signature. It wasn't about inheritance. It was about honoring a promise, about making sure that years of love and care weren't erased by convenience or greed. As I returned to the present, the tension in the room was almost tangible. Trevor leaned forward, his tone clipped. "You could have told us." I looked at him evenly. "You wouldn't have listened." Hannah flinched, guilt flickering across her face. "Mom, we didn't mean to exclude you. It's just..." She trailed off. "Just what I asked softly. You assumed I'd stay quiet, as I always have." Mr. Harold cleared his throat, continuing the reading with professional detachment, but I could see the faint respect in his eyes. He knew the kind of preparation this took. Every signature on those pages represented foresight and quiet endurance. When he finished, the silence that followed wasn't one of victory, but of reckoning. I felt my pulse slow, steadying like the tide against the shore. For once I wasn't managing anyone's crisis or soothing anyone's temper. I was simply standing where I belonged. The attorney nodded, once affirming what I already knew. "This changes everything," he said quietly. Trevor's jaw clenched. Hannah looked down. Around us, relatives exchanged glances, curiosity giving way to something resembling respect. I gathered my folder, pressing my hand lightly against its worn leather cover. Years of preparation of care had come to this single quiet act of standing firm. As I left the estate, the cold Portland air brushed against my face, and the tension I'd carried began to ease. The gray light had turned soft, almost forgiving. I walked to my car slowly, my breath visible in the chilly air. In my reflection on the window, I saw not an aging mother to be dismissed, but a woman who had spent her life holding others up and had finally learned to hold her own ground. The folder in my hand no longer felt heavy. It felt earned. The following morning, I stood in the quiet of Mr. Harold's office as sunlight filtered through the tall windows. The air smelled faintly of cedar and paper, comforting in its order. Shelves of thick legal books lined the walls, their spines gleaming like a gallery of permanence. He reviewed each page of the navy blue folder I had brought, his long fingers moving carefully across the documents. The steady rhythm of his voice as he read was a balm to the storm that had lived inside me for weeks. "Everything is in order," he said, finally glancing up at me. "This will supersede the previous changes. You'll have full control of the estate until further notice." I nodded the relief, quiet but deep. "Then we move forward," I replied. My voice didn't tremble. It hadn't in years. "I'd like additional protections. No one gains access without my written consent." Harold smiled faintly, the kind of smile reserved for someone who had just proven they were not to be underestimated. "Understood. I'll add a clause." We reviewed the paperwork together, titles for the house banking authorizations, asset transfers. I watched his pen glide smoothly as he initialed each section. Every page represented more than legality. It was the record of decades of discipline of sacrifice turned into quiet authority. When I asked for a trust to be created, his brows lifted. "For family?" he asked. I paused before answering. "For Claire." Claire had been my cousin's granddaughter, 26 and steady in ways few young people were. When Marlene's health declined, Claire had shown up without being asked, fetching groceries, reading aloud when Marlene was too tired to speak, keeping her company when others vanished. She was not bound to us by obligation, only by heart. "She's honest," I said simply, "and loyal. That deserves recognition." Harold nodded thoughtfully, writing her name into the trust's framework. As we finished the signatures, I sat back, letting the moment settle. The navy folder that had once felt like a burden was now a symbol of boundaries reclaimed. I thought of the years I had spent walking on eggshells between grief and obligation, between motherhood and invisibility. How easily they had all assumed my quiet meant weakness. But this silence, this restraint, was power measured, deliberate, unstoppable when finally released. When I returned home, the winter light of Portland had softened into silver, the faint drizzle tracing patterns against the kitchen window. I set the folder on the table beside a cup of chamomile tea and looked around at the home I'd kept for decades. The house was worn but dignified, its rooms still carrying Derek's presence in every creak of the floorboards. I imagined his voice then steady and kind, saying what he always did when I doubted myself. "You always know what needs to be done, Lenora." For years, I had managed everything, the finances, the illnesses, the meals, the endless emotional labor no one acknowledged. I remembered sleepless nights by Marlene's hospital bed, holding her hand while monitors beeped in steady rhythm. I remembered sitting with Trevor when his marriage was collapsing, and with Hannah through her first miscarriage being their constant, while they drifted in and out of mine. Every part of me had been given to others until nothing seemed left for myself. Now, for the first time, I felt something unfamiliar yet deeply right balance. I spent the next few days finalizing the trust for Claire. We met in my kitchen, papers spread across the table, steam curling from our tea. She listened carefully, her dark eyes attentive, her fingers tracing the edge of a document without touching it. "I don't know what to say," she murmured. I reached over and placed my hand on hers. "You don't need to say anything," I told her. "You showed up. That's more than most ever did." Her eyes glistened, and for a long moment neither of us spoke. It wasn't about inheritance, it was about acknowledgement, about ensuring that goodness, quiet and consistent, was valued somewhere in a world that often rewarded the loudest voices. That night, when the city settled into its muted hum, I sat by the window overlooking the street lamps. Papers were signed. The estate was protected. The trust was sealed. And for the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for someone else to validate me. I had done it myself. I thought of Trevor and Hannah, how they would react when they realized everything had shifted, when they understood that the mother they had dismissed had outmaneuvered them with grace, not anger. But there was no vengeance in me, only peace. They would have to learn that authority doesn't come from control. It comes from integrity. As I looked at the navy folder resting neatly on the desk, I felt a quiet finality. My life's work, love, loyalty, and relentless steadiness had come full circle. I had protected not just property, but dignity, and that I realized was the true inheritance I would leave behind. The Portland sky was painted in pale amber. As I returned from Harold's office, the weight of the navy folder, now a familiar comfort in my hands. The city moved at its usual rhythm. Trams rattling in the distance, rain gathering in soft streaks across car windshields. But for me, time seemed to slow. I stepped through my front door and inhaled the scent of cedar and tea leaves that had lingered in my home for years. It was the same home I had built, maintained, and protected when everyone else had moved on. Later that evening, the knock on the door came just as I was pouring a second cup of tea. I didn't need to look to know who it was. Trevor stood in the doorway, his expression carefully composed, Hannah a few steps behind him. The tension between them was tangible, their pride colliding with the quiet humility that came when excuses no longer worked. "We should talk," Trevor said. His voice wasn't sharp. This time it carried something almost unfamiliar restraint. They followed me into the kitchen. I gestured to the chairs, pouring tea for them out of old habit. For a while, none of us spoke. The clock on the wall ticked softly, marking the seconds that stretched like threads between us. Finally, Trevor sighed, resting his elbows on the table. "I didn't know about the earlier will," he said, eyes fixed on the cup before him. "You could have told us." I studied his face, older now, still carrying the arrogance of youth, but softened by something else, recognition. "You wouldn't have believed me," I replied calmly. "You were too sure of what you thought I was." Hannah's voice trembled. "We didn't mean to exclude you, Mom. We just thought she stopped. The rest hung unspoken between us. We thought you wouldn't fight back." I let the silence do the work. After a moment, I said simply, "I spent most of my life making sure everyone else was cared for. That doesn't mean I stopped existing when you stopped looking." My tone was even not cruel, just truthful. "You both assumed silence meant weakness, but silence can also mean patience." Trevor nodded slowly, guilt flickering behind his eyes. Hannah looked down, tears glimmering but not falling. For once they weren't defensive. They were listening. I didn't demand apologies. I didn't need them. Some lessons only sink in when time and truth do the teaching. They stayed for a while, talking in quiet tones about Marlene, about their childhood, about the things they now remembered differently. The air felt lighter by the time they left, an unspoken acknowledgement passing between us, fragile but real. After the door closed, I tidied the kitchen, moving with the familiar rhythm of someone who had built her peace from small, deliberate acts. I wiped the counter, refilled the kettle, and returned to my chair by the window. Outside, the evening light had softened into gold. Across the street, a family laughed on their porch, the sound faint but warm. I glanced at the navy folder on my desk. Inside it were not just papers and signatures, but decades of my life, the proof of every decision made with care, every sacrifice made without complaint. I opened it once more, running my fingers over the smooth pages, each one marked with quiet resilience. Harold's words echoed in my mind. You'll have full control of the estate until further notice. But control had never been what I sought. What I wanted was recognition. And now I had it not through confrontation, but through clarity. A week later, Claire came by after work bringing a small bouquet of white lilies. She set them on the table beside the folder, smiling shyly. "You didn't have to do all this," she said, referring to the trust. "I never expected anything." I smiled. "That's exactly why you deserve it." We sat together sipping tea, watching the rain begin again outside the window. The light flickered across her face, young and full of purpose. "I just wanted you to know," I said quietly, "that loyalty still matters. Integrity still matters. And sometimes the smallest acts of kindness build the strongest foundations." She nodded, her eyes glistening. When she left, the house grew still again. I stood for a long time watching the rain against the glass, the city's glow reflected in silver streaks. My hands rested lightly on the edge of the table, the warmth of the teacup fading but pleasant. I thought of all the years behind me, of Derek's laughter in the kitchen, of Marlene's fading voice, of Trevor's first day at school, of Hannah falling asleep on my lap. Life had not been gentle, but it had been meaningful. I had carried more than my share of burdens, but I had never let them break me. Instead, they shaped me into something solid, something quiet and enduring. For the first time in decades, I didn't feel invisible. I didn't need validation or permission or anyone else's acknowledgement. I had written my own ending carefully, firmly, and in ink that would not fade. As the rain softened into mist, I closed the folder and placed it back on the shelf. It no longer symbolized defense, it symbolized peace. My peace. I turned off the lamp, letting the soft glow of the city fill the room. The house was quiet, but it was not empty. It was full of the echoes of a life lived with purpose, of strength that never had to shout to be heard. And as I sat in the calm, I realized something simple yet profound. When you finally stop waiting for gratitude and start living for truth, you stop needing anyone's permission to matter. If this story touched you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that quiet strength has its own kind of power. Tell me what part stayed with you most in the comments, and don't forget to follow for more stories like this.